This evening, I've asked one of the foremost treasures, John, come up. John Parshall is on our board. He has written a book called Shattered Sword. If you ask any military historian, how many books did you sell? 3,000, 5,000 if they're lucky. His is the authoritative book on the Battle of Midway, and it sold 50,000 in several languages now. But I'm asking John to introduce our speaker for the evening. Thank you, sir.
Don always embarrasses me with those sales figures. I was very fortunate to be in the right place at the right time with the right book. Our speaker tonight is my friend James Scott, and James and I were trying to remember last night how long we have known each other, and we think it happened sometime about a decade ago down at the World War II Museum in New Orleans, where we were attending a symposium where we got to see, at that time, 4 of the then living Doolittle Raiders, and have stayed in touch ever since. James and I will also be co-historians on a tour across the Pacific Ocean that the World War II Museum is going to be doing coming up here in March, and I'm very much looking forward to working with him then. James is a fallen newspaper reporter who decided about more than a decade ago that the path to fame and fortune revolved around becoming a military historian. And with the help of his long-suffering attorney wife, ventured valiantly forth on that august career full-time. He has managed to crank out 3 more books than I have, and all of them very well received, starting with 2010, The Attack on the Liberty, then following that up with The War Below, which looks at the U.S. submarine campaign against Japan, Target Tokyo, which deals with the Doolittle Raid, and then finally last year's Rampage, dealing with the Battle of Manila. He is currently working on a 5th book on the firebombing of Tokyo in 1945, and I was giving him some crap last night as we were sipping Mai Tais in my living room that you seem to have been developing a predilection for rather dark subject material, and frankly that's what we're going to be dealing with tonight. The Battle of Manila is not an uplifting, rah-rah, feel-good sort of story. And it is often overshadowed, I think, by the Battle of Iwo Jima, which was going on at exactly the same time. And yet it is absolutely crucial to understand Manila because it is one of the 3 main events in the last 6 months of the war. And certainly the human toll in the Battle of Manila was much greater than Iwo Jima. So, without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to James.
Good evening. And John, thank you so much for that very warm introduction. And you guys do have a real treasure in John. He is just a wealth of World War II knowledge, and he makes probably the finest Mai Tai I have ever had. In fact, I ordered that recipe book today online from Amazon, so it was so good. Don, thank you so much for inviting me here. Don reached out to me about a year ago to ask me to come up here, and he's been taking me around for the last 2 days. I think we've got another adventure-filled day tomorrow before I fly back, and it's been truly just a great experience. Thanks also to the board. You guys, I had a wonderful lunch, lots of laughs today. Everything you guys have done for the last more than 3 decades is really tremendous, and in bringing out and preserving these stories for these veterans, not just in honor of them, but also to make sure that for future generations going forward that those stories are remembered and studied and whatnot. And Don, I don't know where you find all these amazing men. I mean, it's like you're a bloodhound out there hunting down veterans all over all over. I tell you, you should rent your services out to historians looking for firsthand contacts. So, also wanted to thank the Minnesota Historical Society. This is an amazing museum. Don, of course, gave me a tour of it earlier today, and it's truly just an absolute treasure. We also have a couple of veterans that are going to be up here today with us, or one veteran from the Battle of Manila, Vic Liptrap, who was there in southern Manila and saw a lot of the images you're going to see today, saw them firsthand, and also Dr. Ruben Fermin, whose father was on the Bataan Death March, which was truly just one of the worst atrocities of World War II, and he's going to be up here with us today as well. American General Douglas MacArthur, driven from the Philippines at the start of World War II, famously vowed to return. This is the untold story of his homecoming. The 29-day battle to retake Manila in February 1945 proved a fight unlike any other in the Pacific War. A bloody urban brawl that forced American soldiers to battle block by block, building by building, and even room by room. The end result was the catastrophic destruction of the city and a rampage by Japanese forces that terrorized the civilian population. Landmarks were demolished, neighborhoods torched, countless women raped, their husbands and children murdered. Not only did this battle give American war planners a glimpse of what an invasion of the Japanese homeland might involve, but those brief weeks in February 1945, literally 75 years ago this month, transformed a city once known as the Pearl of the Orient and decimated generations of Filipino families, the ripples of which still echo through their lives even today, almost a century later. To truly appreciate the tragedy of the Battle of Manila, it's important to rewind to the turn of the 20th century. The United States had captured the Philippines along with Cuba during the Spanish-American War, but unlike Cuba, for which we granted independence, the U.S. decided to hang on to the Philippines. The rationale for that was best described by Arthur MacArthur, General Douglas MacArthur's father, who'd helped capture Manila, and later served as one of the early military governors. Quote, "The archipelago," he told Congress in 1902, "is the finest group of islands in the world. Its strategic position is unexcelled by that of any other position on the globe." Now, policymakers realized that Manila, which would serve as America's front door to the business markets in China, India, and Malaya, needed a facelift to better attract industry and help reflect America's growing global status. To spearhead that transformation, the U.S. hired famed municipal planner and architect Daniel Burnham, who over the course of his career helped many cities, including Chicago, San Francisco. He's the one who helped with the redo of the National Mall in Washington. He also designed Union Station, which is the iconic transportation hub right there on Capitol Hill that is still there today. In fact, every time I walk through it, when I park there to go to the Library of Congress to do research, I can't help but think of him. Now, Burnham saw incredible potential in Manila with its vast natural resources, its centuries-old Spanish churches, and of course, the ancient walled city of Intramuros, which is the 160-acre heart of Manila, which was built soon after the city's founding in 1571. Quote, "Possessing the Bay of Naples, the winding river of Paris, and the canals of Venice," Burnham wrote, "Manila has before it an opportunity unique in the history of modern times, the opportunity to create a unified city equal to the greatest of the Western world with the unparalleled and priceless addition of a tropical setting." In the 4 decades leading up to World War II, Manila developed into a small slice of America and Asia, home not only to thousands of U.S. service members, but employees of companies like General Electric, Studebaker, Del Monte, and B.F. Goodrich. Often called the Pearl of the Orient, the city boasted incredible quality of life with department stores and social clubs, golf courses, and swimming pools. Quote, "Manila is by far the most beautiful of all cities in the Orient," the New York Times declared in 1932. "From the top of the University Club, it seems half hidden in a canopy of trees, green everywhere, a city within a park." Now, on the eve of World War II, one of Manila's most prominent residents was none other than General Douglas MacArthur, who lived with his wife and then 3-year-old son in the penthouse atop the luxurious Manila Hotel. Like his father, Douglas MacArthur's life was long intertwined with the Philippines, where he'd served often ever since his graduation from West Point in 1903. Quote, "In this city," he once said, "my mother had died, my wife had been courted, my son had been born." For MacArthur, the son of a career military officer who'd spent much of his life pinballing around the United States and the globe, Manila really was the closest thing he had to a hometown. But more than just Douglas MacArthur enjoyed it. Quote, to live in Manila in 1941, remembered CBS News correspondent Bill Dunn, was to experience the good life. But that good life ended on December 7th when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor and invaded the Philippines, launching the United States into war. Hoping to avoid a bloody battle for the city, MacArthur declared Manila an open city and evacuated his forces to the Bataan Peninsula and the fortified island of Corregidor, about 27 miles out in the bay. For MacArthur, this was far more than just a strategic retreat. He was abandoning his home, forced to leave so fast that the family left the Christmas tree still standing in the corner of their parlor in their home atop the Manila Hotel. Japanese forces seized Manila on January 2nd, 1942, fanning out through the capital and rounding up those thousands of American civilians who were unable to escape and interning them at the University of Santo Tomas. Now, these internees came from all backgrounds and boasted a wide range of skills, from doctors and accountants to school teachers, carpenters. There were even 2 golf pros there. The captives hustled to transform this 50-acre campus into a functioning small city, building latrines and beds, sewing mosquito nets and pillowcases, and even planting crops. Internees went so far as to set up a school system for the 500 children that were interned there, complete with their own library with more than 7,000 volumes. Despite that resourcefulness, conditions, as you might imagine, were quite cramped. Quote, if you want privacy, read a sign in one bathroom, close your eyes. Now, MacArthur endured 77 days in the tunnels of Corregidor before escaping on March 11, 1942, with his family and staff in a torpedo boat. For MacArthur, this was an agonizing event, forced to leave behind thousands of Filipino and American soldiers, troops who had trusted him, and who would soon face the notorious Bataan Death March, followed by years in Japan's wretched prisoner of war camps. Upon reaching Australia, MacArthur made a promise: I shall return. And that promise, those 3 words, would drive him as the weeks turned to months and then years. Now, Manila suffered greatly during the 3 years of the Japanese occupation. Officers seized homes and cars from residents. Others looted food supplies in department stores, stole farm equipment, and left fields to rot. Store shelves sat empty, and basic necessities like medicine vanished. Felipe Buen Camino, writing in his diary, captured the frustration of many residents when he wrote, quote, what kind of an army is this that fights a war with pianos and nice residences? As the years passed, Manila's economy collapsed, and the social fabric began to unravel. An army of beggars soon flooded the streets, while others resorted to thievery, including the plundering of graves in search of jewelry, dentures, eyeglasses, even clothing, anything that could be bartered or sold to buy a fistful of rice. Families unable to care for their children went so far as to abandon them to orphanages or even sell them. Starvation, meanwhile, ran rampant, claiming as many as 500 lives a day. Marcial Chauco, a Manila attorney whose diary captured the horror many endured, described it in December 1944. Quote, today we are living under conditions in which only the fittest among us can hope to survive. And for folks who might not be able to see it, there's a quote on this slide that I think more than anything else best captures how bad the suffering had become in Manila. This was from an American intelligence report, August 31st, 1944, and that quote reads, it is cheaper to buy a child than a hog in the city of Manila today. American families locked up behind the gates of Santo Tomas and other internment camps suffered equally. That earlier ingenuity these internees had shown faded as the daily caloric intake plummeted and starvation took hold. A medical survey conducted in January 1945 revealed that the average male internee had lost 51 pounds, the average female 32. To survive, desperate internees ate dogs, cats, pigeons, and even rats, which, as you can see right here in this diary, were selling for 8 pesos each on the camp's black market. Quote, I was worried about a lump in my stomach, Louise Goldthorpe wrote in another one of her diary entries. Then I found it was my backbone I was feeling. By January 1945, the nearly 3,700 internees at Santo Tomas starved to death at a rate of 3 to 4 every day. These 5 internees lost a combined total of 273 pounds. Quote, "We survived on hope," one internee remembered, "hope that the American forces would arrive." And those hopes were rewarded on January 9th, 1945, when MacArthur's forces returned. Hitting the beaches of Lingayen Gulf in preparation for the 100-mile drive south to liberate Manila. Now, standing in MacArthur's way was Japanese General Tomoyuki Yamashita, whose job was to turn the Philippines into a tar pit, to bog down America en route north toward the Japanese homeland. Yamashita had proven himself early in the war, seizing Singapore from the British and earning the nickname the Tiger of Malaya. But his rivalry with War Minister Hideki Tojo had led the latter to park Yamashita in Manchuria on the war's sidelines. Only after Tojo's ouster, following the fall of the Mariana Islands, had Yamashita's career been resurrected. And just as MacArthur had come to redeem his promise, so too was Yamashita equally certain of his fate. He had come to die, but he didn't plan to do so in Manila. Instead, he divided up his army and planned to fight a protracted battle in the jungles and mountains of Luzon. Now, in contrast, Rear Admiral Sanji Iwabuchi, who commanded the Manila Naval Defense Force, had no intention of abandoning the city, even if Yamashita had demanded it. Iwabuchi had been a failed sea captain early in the war. He'd had his ship shot out from under him off of Guadalcanal, and he'd survived, which in Japanese culture was a big disgrace. He'd spent much of the rest of the war parked behind a desk in Tokyo until the deaths of so many other more capable seafaring officers had led to his career resurrection, and he was sent to the Philippines. And in Manila, he saw a chance to redeem himself by creating an urban bloodletting similar to Stalingrad. To accomplish this, he divided his 17,000 soldiers and Marines into several geographic commands that covered northern, central, and southern Manila. Iwabuchi's ultimate plan called for a final defense centered around Intramuros, the ancient citadel guarded by towering walls, many of them 40 feet thick at the base and 20 feet high. Around the walled city, Iwabuchi planned a perimeter of large concrete buildings. These were small fortresses, really, designed to withstand typhoons and earthquakes. To make it even harder for the advancing Americans, the Japanese barricaded the insides of these buildings with chairs and desks. And to further slow the advancing Americans, they built staggered walls, filling them with dirt throughout the passageways that the Americans would have to navigate around inside battles. Iwabuchi's forces likewise booby-trapped more than 50 intersections inside central Manila. This is the corner of what was then Dart and Oregon Street, where the Japanese had set out 25 oil drums filled with concrete and sunk 16 railroad axles into the asphalt. In addition, the Japanese had planted a number of landmines here, including improvised explosives using old beach mines, all of which was covered by a pillbox you can see in the top right-hand corner with a machine gun. This is a photograph of another barricaded intersection in which the Japanese had taken 2 vehicle bodies and cabled them together and then anchored it on the tree here. And again, you can see poles set upright into the ground behind it. Now, to take the city, American forces carved up Manila. The 37th Infantry and the 1st Cavalry would enter the city from the north. The 37th Infantry would cross the river and then swing toward the old walled city here, while the 1st Cavalry would then envelop Manila from the east. The 11th Airborne would then drive up from the south and close the city's back door. Now, despite these preparations, MacArthur was convinced that the Japanese would evacuate the city, just as he had done at the start of the war. He was so confident of this fact that he had his headquarters staff beginning planning his liberation parade, down to picking the individual jeep assignments of his officers, and even planning the parade routes that went back in front of the Manila Hotel, his old home there down by the waterfront. Complicating the challenge for American war planners at this time was the mix of intelligence that was coming out of Manila. Up until December of 1945, a lot of the Filipino guerrillas were radioing reports that it appeared the Japanese were leaving the city. Trucks full of material and men were headed out, which was in accordance with Yamashita's plan to evacuate. But by January, those messages changed. By January, Filipino guerrillas began reporting the fortification of the city, the construction of pillboxes, the planting of landmines, the barricading of intersections. Residents in Manila who for 3 long years had waited and prayed for MacArthur's return watched this growing fortification with alarm. Quote, "Defeat is a bitter pill that the Japanese will not swallow," one resident wrote in her diary. Defeat is the one thing that can make them turn into beasts. 6:35 p.m. on February 3rd, the American cavalry rolled into Manila, prepared to liberate the city. In the northern suburbs, troops were greeted as celebrities. And nowhere was that more true than at Santo Tomas, where the cavalrymen arrived around 8:30 p.m. that night. Internee Tressa Roca captured the excitement in her diary. Quote, "Before the men in the tanks knew what was going on, they were pulled out of them and lifted on the shoulders of our scrawny fellow internees. It was impossible to hold back the worshiping and joyous internees." That night, starving internees feasted on army rations while American troops spoiled the children with candy. Frank Robertson, a reporter with International News Service, described just such a scene in his first dispatch from the camp. Quote, "One of the unforgettable things was the slow smile of wonderment on the pale, tense face of a little girl of 4 tasting chocolate for the first time." Of course, many in the city were starving as well, and American troops throughout the battle would find themselves swarmed by hungry civilians, like this young Filipino girl here clinging to a box of army rations. But the excitement over America's arrival proved short-lived. Iwabuchi gave the order on February 3rd to begin the planned destruction of the city. Incendiary squads swept through districts north of the Pasig River and began setting fires and dynamiting buildings. MacArthur's pilot, Dusty Rhodes, witnessed the scene from the air. Quote, "The spectacle was an appalling sight," he wrote in his diary. The entire downtown section of the city was a mass of flames rising 200 feet in the air. Manila residents grabbed what belongings they could carry and fled. General Robert Baitler, commander of the 37th Infantry, described it best in his report. Quote, "We were powerless to stop it. We had no way of knowing in which of the thousands of places the demolitions were being controlled," he wrote. Big, modern, reinforced steel and concrete office buildings were literally blown from their foundations to settle crazily in twisted heaps. In addition, the Japanese blew all the bridges over the river which divided the city. After destroying the city's northern districts, the Japanese fell back across the river into central Manila, forcing American troops to cross the Pasig and begin what would prove to be an incredibly bloody urban fight. Block by block, American soldiers pressed deeper into the city, frequently slowed by the fortifications at intersections, which required troops to blast their way through the walls of the buildings alongside each street in order to attack the rear of a pillbox. Just as perilous were the fortified buildings, where Japanese used the higher floors to target the advancing Americans, often dropping Molotov cocktails onto the streets below. Quote, "The preferred solution was to use cannons to blast the upper floors to rubble and then move in," one infantry major said. An equally favored alternative was to burn the building. When these wouldn't work, riflemen moved in to retake the building floor by floor. One of the worst such battles occurred for Rizal Hall at the University of the Philippines, where American cavalrymen literally inched room by room, their backs pressed against the wall, hurling hand grenades into the next rooms to drive the Japanese out. This went on for 2 days, and by the end of the second day, the Americans and the Japanese still had not advanced past the second floor of this building. And as the sun began to go down, neither side wanted to surrender and pull out of the building for the night, so both instead prepared to hunker down. The Japanese attacked around 8:30 that night, and the Americans repelled them. They attacked again about half an hour later, and again their attack was repelled. The Americans then sat there in the dark on the second floor of this blasted building, the inside of it filled with dust and barricades, the staircases a mess of rubble. They sat in the dark with their fingers pressed against the triggers of their guns, their rifles, and they listened at about 1:30 in the morning when the Americans began to hear the Japanese singing on the other side of the building. This is from their report. Quote, "This commotion went on for about 45 minutes, culminating in a final burst of song and loud shouting, immediately followed by many reports of exploding grenades and dynamite charges. The American cavalrymen continued to sit in the dark and listen. More singing, followed by more explosions, then silence. This pattern went on at half-hour intervals until around 4 a.m., at which time a lasting silence finally settled over the building. At daybreak the next morning, the Americans moved in to discover 77 Japanese had blown themselves up that night while they had listened to them. Now, MacArthur refused to allow planes to bomb the city for fear of killing civilians, but he relented and allowed artillery after the Americans suffered heavy casualties crossing the river. Over the course of the battle, American forces would fire more than 42,000 mortar and artillery rounds into the city. Between Japanese demolitions and American artillery, Manila was literally being destroyed from the inside and the out. Men, women, and children retreated below ground, where conditions inside cramped air raid shelters devolved as the hours turned to days. Bunkers built to house a single family often held multiple, and with so many bodies pressed so close together, the air inside stagnated and the heat soared. Hans Steiner captured his experience in a letter to his mother when he said, quote, "We lived like dogs," he wrote. "All around us were fires and explosions. It was the best imagination of hell one could get." And of course, such shelters proved easy prey for marauding Japanese troops who at this point were literally going block by block through the residential districts, setting homes afire and targeting civilians. This is a gentleman sitting outside San Lazaro Hospital, and you can see his cheek has been ripped away from shrapnel by a grenade blast, that grenade that was tossed into the shelter where he was taking refuge. Many others proved too injured to walk, including this woman who was placed in a basket for transportation by her neighbors to an aid station. In his diary, Santo Tomas internee Robert Weigel described the parade of wounded who came through the gates of the camp each day. Quote, "They are so far beyond recognition that in many cases one can't tell whether they are men or women, boys or girls, dead or alive." Now, by February 9th, just 6 days after the Americans had rolled into Manila, Iwabuchi realized that the fight was largely lost. The Americans were across the river and pressing deeper into central Manila, while his fortifications along the city's southern border likewise threatened to collapse. The Americans had far more firepower and far more troops. And at this point, the fight took a very evil turn, devolving from a battle over one of Asia's great cities into one of the worst human catastrophes of World War II. An examination of the timeline of the dozens of atrocities that occurred in Manila point to February 9th as the fulcrum on which the violence shifted from attacks on suspected guerrillas to organized mass extermination. American war crimes investigators would later tally 27 major atrocities inside Manila. The Japanese tossed babies in the air, skewering on the tips of their bayonets. Troops decapitated hundreds of others and burned thousands to death alive. The lucky ones received a bullet. In one such example, Japanese Marines stormed the Red Cross headquarters, going room by room, shooting and bayoneting more than 50 civilians, including 2 infants, one just 10 days old. The Japanese likewise burned to death more than 500 other men, women, and children inside the German Club, which was a large social hall in downtown Manila, where nearby residents had gathered to take refuge from the fires and the artillery. Troops also forced hundreds of other civilians into the dining hall at St. Paul's College, where they had rigged the chandeliers with explosives and then dynamited, killing 360 people. When I was back in Manila in February, actually, a survivor of this blast in the St. Paul's dining hall came out to one of the events we hosted. One of the more gruesome crimes, the Japanese converted a home on Singalong Street into a house of horrors. Troops cut a hole in the upstairs floor and then marched blindfolded civilians up there, forced them to kneel over that hole, and a Japanese Marine then cut their heads off with a sword so that the head and the body would then fall into the hole below. War crimes investigators, by counting skulls, later determined that 200 men died inside this building, though 9 miraculously survived, including Eugene Bayat, who did this sketch in March 1945 for war crimes investigators. The atrocities went beyond murder. The Japanese rounded up thousands of women, locking many of them inside these 4 buildings here. The last one on the end was the Bayview Hotel, which had been Jean MacArthur's first home when she moved to Manila in 1935. There, inside rooms where tourists had once enjoyed Manila's legendary sunsets, Japanese troops assaulted hundreds of women. Quote, "I was raped between 12 and 15 times that night," one witness later testified. "I cannot remember exactly how many times. I was so tired and horror-stricken that it became a living nightmare." The Japanese did not discriminate. They killed men and women, the old and the young, the strong and the infirm. Alongside thousands of Filipinos, they slaughtered Russians, Spaniards, Germans, Americans, Indians, as well as two Supreme Court justices, the family of a senator, and scores of priests. Quote, "The list of known dead that has come to my attention sounds like a who's who of the Philippines," Marcial Chauco wrote in his diary. Those residents who were able began the long march out of the city, a dangerous journey through an apocalyptic wasteland. It was a scene best described by Life magazine photographer Carl Meidens. Quote, "All morning we had seen the long files of people walking mutely rearward past the advancing infantry. Some of them limped with improvised wound dressings. Many of them walked, heaven knows how, with open wounds. The Americans were so inundated with escaping refugees that engineers had to build a catwalk to help ease the flow out of the city." Now, by the morning of February 23rd, American forces had isolated the last of Iwabuchi's troops inside the old walled city and a handful of surrounding government buildings. The fight to retake the walled city began with a massive artillery barrage at 7:30 a.m., one so destructive it literally blackened the sky, turning day into night. In 1 hour, American forces fired 10,000 mortar and artillery rounds at the walls surrounding the Intramuros. Every second of that bombardment saw an average of 3 shells fired, creating a continuous rolling thunder that terrified the residents, as you might imagine, inside. Finally, an hour after it began, the guns fell silent as the assault troops prepared to move in to the walled city. Quote, "The ensuing silence," remembered one journalist, "seemed even louder than the bombardment." Once inside, troops discovered that most of the survivors were almost exclusively women and children. War crimes investigators later determined that the Japanese in the days leading up to the assault had killed an estimated 4,000 men. Many of them had been locked inside cells at Fort Santiago, which is an old Spanish military installation inside the walled city, where the Japanese then set them on fire. Hundreds of others were found piled one on top of another, sealed inside the underground dungeons there that dated back to the Spanish Inquisition. Many of the children rescued were now orphans, including these 3, one carrying a bucket of utensils and the other, in the bottom corner here, a baby doll. But the battle was not over. America still had to eliminate the last of Iwabuchi's forces, holed up inside a handful of government buildings that ringed the walled city. America blasted the legislature with artillery and then sent in assault troops. The building eventually fell at noon on February 28th. Troops then pounded the agriculture and finance buildings. Iwabuchi decided to make his final stand inside the agricultural building. Quote, "If we run out of bullets, we will use grenades," he told his men. "If we run out of grenades, we will cut the enemy down with swords. If we break our swords, we will kill them by sinking our teeth in their throats." But Iwabuchi's vigor withered under the onslaught of America's merciless guns, which pulverized the columns and ripped gaping wounds in the concrete walls around him, exposing the building's sinuous veins of rebar. Iwabuchi had presided over one of the most barbaric massacres of World War II. His troops had wantonly slaughtered tens of thousands of men, women, and children in some of the most cruel and horrible ways. Survival was not an option, and he knew it. So Iwabuchi summoned the last of his remaining forces and apologized for leading them to doom. Quote, "If anyone has the courage to escape, please do so," he instructed his men. "If not, please take your lives here." The admiral then retreated into his quarters on the main floor on the northwest side of the building, where, armed with a knife, he slit open his belly. A handful of Japanese troops at this point did in fact surrender, like this individual pulled from the agricultural building. But most, however, chose to die. On March 3rd, 1945, 29 days after the Americans had rolled into the city, the Battle of Manila finally ended. The fight to retake the Philippine capital has resulted in the deaths of 16,665 Japanese, the near total destruction of Admiral Iwabuchi's forces. MacArthur's men suffered a little over 1,000 killed and another 5,500 wounded. Civilians bore the brunt of the horror with an estimated 100,000 killed, many of them slaughtered by the Japanese. The dead were often so disfigured that relatives had to identify them through clothes, cigarette cases, and keychains. For folks who may not be able to read this quote in the back, it's from a letter on February 23rd from John Osborne in which he writes, quote, "The rape of Nanking is reported as a tame performance compared with that Manila has suffered in the past 3 weeks. The Japanese have murdered wholesale and retail. To call them beasts would be to slander the beasts. To call them fiends would be to slander the fiends." Those who found remains, however, were the lucky ones. Others would have no resolution, a sentiment best captured in a letter by another Santo Tomas internee. Quote, "With a heavy heart full of pity, I have, during these recent days and weeks, observed the searchers, the seekers after lost loved ones. Daily they have gone out the gate, hoping to find some trace of relative or friend, to change the dreadful uncertainty to certainty, that would be the certainty of death. First, they visit the site of the old home, now probably but a heap of ashes and broken walls. Then to the homes of relatives and friends for news of the lost. Finally, they just walk the streets, looking at the dead, who today are numerous." Over the city of Manila hung that awful stench of death. Worse than the smell, remembered Major Chuck Hen, was the taste of death, which settled on the tongue. Quote, "No amount of spitting," he recalled, "could clear it away." The battle for Manila had destroyed 613 city blocks, an area containing 11,000 buildings, homes, churches, banks, schools. More than 200,000 residents were left homeless. A post-war American survey estimated that the damage to Manila by today's standards would total more than $10 billion. And of course, beyond the structural losses were the cultural ones. From the centuries-old Spanish churches to the museums filled with paintings, libraries filled with archives and priceless literary works. And of course, the economy was in shambles, a sentiment best described by Abraham Hartendorp. Quote, "The manager of one of the Manila oil companies, and speaking of rebuilding his plant, stated that he would have to begin again, at the beginning, with a land survey." More than anything, however, was that incalculable loss to the nation's precious human capital, made up of individuals like Dr. Nick Reyes, who'd founded Far Eastern University, and who had offered so much to the promise to the Philippines, which would soon be independent, until he and his family were murdered on February 9th. And just as destabilizing, too, in the long runs were the deep wounds left in so many nuclear families. Child's loss of its parents, the parent's loss of a child, grandparents' loss. I mean, this is a battle that really left a multi-generational wound in the people of the Philippines. Amid this sea of destruction, MacArthur returned to the Manila Hotel to find his own home in ruins. Gone was his vast personal library. Gone were his father's Civil War mementos and medals. Gone was his own son Arthur's baby book, a loss that crushed Gene MacArthur. Quote, "You wanted to know about my apartment at the hotel," Gene MacArthur wrote in a letter to a friend. "Of that, as well as everything else I know in Manila, it is gone." General Yamashita remained elusive until the end of the war, when he walked out of the mountains and surrendered. He was put on trial in the fall of February 1945, in the first war crimes trial in all of Asia, accused of failing to control his troops. Yamashita blamed everything on Iwabuchi, even though, as evidence showed, he was in touch with the admiral throughout much of the battle and could have intervened. Furthermore, Yamashita was no stranger to this level of violence. His own troops had committed similar atrocities after his victory in Singapore, while his chief of staff, Akira Muto, had been a key player during the rape of Nanking. Over the course of 32 days, the Battle of Manila was replayed before a panel of 5 judges and a total of 16,000 spectators who jammed the courtroom, which today is the ballroom at the U.S. Embassy in Manila, sitting shoulder to shoulder to watch this trial. A parade of 286 witnesses, doctors, lawyers, teachers, even gravediggers, testified about what happened to them and their loved ones. Yamashita was convicted, December 7th, 1945, his dogged defense lawyers appealed his case all the way to the United States Supreme Court, but ultimately lost. February 23rd, 1946, in a sugarcane field 40 miles south of Manila, Yamashita was brought out, stripped of all his military decorations and even his uniform, where he was hanged. Yamashita's execution did little, however, to provide solace for the victims, many of whom would battle years of physical torment. Others wrestled with emotional wounds, in fact, still wrestle even today with those wounds. Scores more struggled to understand the barbarity that was inflicted upon them. Quote, "It was just total hatred and savagery," recalled survivor Johnny Rocha. "You cannot explain it otherwise." Nearly a half century after the battle, survivors formed an organization, the Memorare Manila 1945 Foundation, dedicated to preserving the story of the civilian sacrifices during the city's liberation. To memorialize those killed, the organization erected a statue inside the old walled city of a weeping mother cradling a dead infant, surrounded by other dead and dying figures. The inscription on the base of that statue provides a powerful epitaph. Quote, "This memorial is dedicated to all those victims of war, many of whom went nameless and unknown to a common grave, or never even knew a grave at all, their bodies having been consumed by fire or crushed to dust beneath the rubble of ruins. Let this monument be the gravestone for each and every one." And that concludes my uplifting presentation on the Battle of Manila.
The gentlemen that are on the stage right now are people that experienced some of the sad stories that James presented this evening. Vic Liptrap is from Kansas. Lived in Wichita. His father was a mechanic. He was inducted into the service at Leavenworth, did his basic training at Camp Roberts, but something about $50 jump pay lured him to join the Airborne. He went to Fort Benning. The 11th Airborne was made up of the 511th Parachute Infantry Regiment and the 187th Glider Infantry and the 188th Glider Infantry. Vic was in the, at that time, was in the 711th Ordnance Company that took care of ammunition and vehicles. After they trained, he was part of an advance party that went out to a place called Good Enough Island, 200 of them, off of New Guinea. It was the advance party for the 11th Airborne to move to the Pacific and eventually into the Philippines. Vic was part of the follow-up, the 11th Airborne was part of the follow-up of the invasion of Leyte, which is another story. And at that time, I mentioned he was in the 711th Ordnance Company. Vic, I want you to tell me, answer this for me. Why did you transfer from an ordnance company to the 511th Foxtrot Airborne?
A buddy of mine and I, we decided we'd been there, and for one thing, we spent about 3 months on the island just as reserves to join the outfit, and I hadn't been doing anything. And then a few months more in the ordnance, and we just figured we'd like to get into action and do some good.
And supporting Vic's story about a man of action, I won't say how many years he's past 90, but up until a couple of years ago, he and his wife on their July birthdays were doing skydiving. Is that a man of action or not? Vic, tell us about what happened as you moved up into Luzon and participated in the Battle of Manila.
We made the jump on Tagaytay Ridge and met up with, I think it was the 187th that came in from the ocean side. And then we advanced towards, got in trucks, went to a little, stopped at a little town of Imus. And from then on, we were on foot and walked in and started walking into Manila. And the first, I don't know, half day or so, we were met by the Filipinos and they all were glad to see us and brought tomatoes and chicken and stuff out. And then we met the resistance from the Japs, and they had secured the area and thought they would be attacked by the ocean side. So we went right along by the beach, and so then they turned their heavy guns, 5-inch naval guns and everything they had, and started firing at us. But the shells, most of them went over our heads. Their guns wouldn't come down that low. So all night long we were sitting in front of the guns with the shells going over.
You came in from the south into Manila.
Yeah.
Where did you end up? And can you talk about that advance from the south side up to your final objective?
Well, we fought our way into the like Nichols Field and Clark Field, and we fought our way across there, and they were just solid pillboxes. They were big guns, were dug in, heavily dug in, and about the only way they could get rid of them was to bring in the heavy artillery and just pound them for like 24 hours a day. And also aircraft, they come in and try to bomb them to break through the mounds of dirt and everything that they had covering them. So it was quite a timely deal just to get through the airfields.
And you ended up at Nichols Field, right?
Pardon?
You ended up at Nichols?
Nichols Field, yeah. And Clark.
And Clark.
Yeah.
Tell us about in any major action that you saw up in that area.
On the airfields?
Yes. I think you said that they were pretty heavily defended, right?
Yeah, very heavily defended. And like I say, there wasn't a lot they could do as the infantry to get in until they busted them apart until we could go in with machine guns and light armor.
Dr. Reuben Furman is a retired medical doctor, lives in Hudson, Wisconsin. He and I have something in common. We were both born in 1939. So he was, as a young person, he had some experience to some of the devastation that James described. But his father had terrible involvement with it. Can you talk about your experience in that time, Reuben, and that of your father?
First of all, I'd like to thank all the veterans and soldiers in the room for their service to our country. And I consider it a great privilege and honor to be with Mr. Liptrap. To the question, my father, before the war, was in the employ of the United States Army, which had a headquarters in Manila. He was a stenographer for one of the commanders. And so when the war broke out and Manila fell, and the army had to go up in the mountains, my father had to go with them. Eventually, they had, when Bataan fell, of course, they had to go to the march, and my father was with them. But fortunately, he and some of his friends were able to escape the march and was able to make his way back home to our town, which was outside of Manila. It's near the border with Manila. My mother said that when he came home, he was so thin, emaciated, and dark from being out in the sun, all through those days. And I didn't recognize him, and neither did our dog recognize him. So it was a terrible time in those days. Reading James Scott's book kind of brought back memories of some of the experiences I had, later on in the war, because I was still a little boy, little toddler when the war broke out, and don't remember much of anything. And as a matter of fact, I don't remember my father coming back home from Bataan. I do remember some of the events that I experienced later on when I was old enough to remember things. I remember that Japanese soldiers would sometimes come in the middle of the night to look for men, resistance fighters. And one time they knocked on the door of my uncle's house, and he didn't open the door immediately because he thought, oh, this may be robbers or what have you. So finally the Japanese officer kept on banging on the door, and he finally opened the door, and the Japanese officer asked, why didn't you open the door? And then he hit him with the butt of his rifle. And then another time, they came to our house, and being a child at the time and hearing of the terrible things that the Japanese soldiers had done to people, I'd heard that they would throw babies, as Mr. Scott mentioned in his book. They would throw babies up in the air and catch them with the bayonets. And you can just imagine how that would sound to a little boy like I was at that time. So when this knock came on the door, and it was a Japanese soldier, I immediately went to the kitchen, hid under the table. And I hid there until the soldier came by, and I could see the leggings on his legs, Didn't see his face, but just his legs as he walked by. And then he didn't see me, of course. Then he didn't find any, what he was looking for. He left, and I then came up. But I was so deathly afraid that he'd find me. The other experience that I vividly remember is when, during the last stages of the war there, the Japanese soldiers were going from house to house in our town looking for the men. And my father had heard of this, so he decided we have to move out of town because he was with the U.S. Army before, and people in town knew this information and could very well get the information to the Japanese. So my father and all our family, which was my mother and me and my younger brother, we moved to Manila to my mother's cousin's house. We were there, but unfortunately, at that time also, the Japanese started to do the search for the men all over the district. And so my father and my mother's cousin hid up in the attic of the house. And my mother, she opened all the windows, and we stood by the window. I was standing by her, and we looked outside, and then a couple of soldiers came by, and seeing that the windows were all open, they probably thought that somebody had come by and taken all the men. So they asked my mother, have they taken the men? My mother said, yeah. So they just walked by and then did not come to our house. But I could see the other neighbors, the Japanese soldiers would come into their house, and I saw this one man go out of the window and stand on the ledge trying to escape the searchers. But they finally found him and took him out. In the afternoon, as we were standing there, 2 more soldiers came by and again asked my mother, have they taken the men from the house? And she said, yeah. So they again walked by and didn't bother us. Finally, at night, the search stopped, and my mother told my father and my mother's cousin that it's okay to come down now. And they all came down very sweaty and hot from being in the attic. Our roof there was made of corrugated iron, and when the sun beats down on the corrugated tin roof, it gets so hot underneath. So fortunately, they were able to escape the Japanese, and we were able to go back home later to our hometown. But then when the Japanese were leaving town, they burned the town and destroyed the bridge connecting us to Manila. I remember also that when the U.S. Army came to town, seeing that the bridge had been blown down, they were coming in amphibious tanks. I'd never seen those before, and people were very happy to see them, of course. And then they marched into town, and the kids, we were shouting, "Victory, Joe! Victory, Joe!" We were so happy to see them.
Vic, after you left the Philippines, left Luzon, you went up to Okinawa and Japan. Tell us about what the 11th Airborne did as a part of the security for MacArthur as the capture and the capitulation in Japan occurred.
We went into Yokohama, Atsugi Airport, and they started flying the ships in, I think about 5 o'clock in the morning, and I went in with a group about 9 o'clock, and then MacArthur came in I think about 1 o'clock. And they met us at the airport with all the old motor equipment they had, which was run down charcoal burning buses and trucks, and a few old U.S. Automobiles, all in very bad shape. And so they made a motor pool out of all these cars that they brought in, and they put a two-star general in charge of the motor pool to allocate the cars to any of the officers there that had to get someplace. As we didn't bring any Jeeps or anything with us. So for the first week there, I guess it was our company, I think, that was in charge of all the cars. And we would, they'd assign us to one of the officers that had to go someplace, and we'd deliver them wherever they had to go. And so that was, then we'd have a car, and I suppose we should have went back to the motor pool and get somebody else, and we usually did. Sometimes we'd take it and pick up some of our buddies and run around looking around. So it was quite an enjoyable week for me, but we had a lot of entertainment.
Well, I think you told me a story about a Russian general coming in. Can you describe that incident?
The one time it was a Russian general and a Russian lieutenant, and they wanted to go into Tokyo to the Russian embassy. And we had orders, our orders were not to go into Tokyo at all. It was off limits. So anyway, the general was in command, so we took off for Tokyo. They weren't too sure of how to get there, so we'd have to stop and inquire from some Japanese walking along the way. And of course, they were scared to even talk to us, and they didn't know Russian, and the lieutenant didn't know Japanese, so we had a little struggle getting there, but we made it. And then it was, the Russian embassy was just a little, it looked like about a 5-room house, and it had, 8 or 10 people in it. And they asked me if I'd like some lunch, and I said, well, so I had a piece of apple pie and a glass of vodka. So that was kind of an interesting trip. The whole week there, was just a lot of fun. We did a lot of looking around, and also one time a commander came down. He wanted to ride out to the battleship Missouri, where they signed a peace treaty, and he got in and wanted to know where I was from. I said, Kansas, and he didn't say any more, but turns out he was Commander Harold Stassen, the youngest governor that Minnesota had ever had.
Yeah.
But of course, I didn't know who he was. He didn't know me.
Well, Vic, did you get in any trouble?
Pardon?
Did you get into any trouble for driving into Tokyo?
Any trouble?
Yeah.
No, I stayed clear of trouble. We had a good time.
Dr. Furman, you grew up in the Philippines. You went to medical school there, and having not forgotten his roots, Dr. Furman and his wife, Mary, who's up in the front row here, they have gone back many times to the Philippines to provide medical attention. Can you talk about your coming to the States? You practice at Swedish in Minneapolis, and your trips back to the Philippines to help the Filipino people that had no medical attention.
Yes, I studied medicine in the Philippines. I grew up in the Philippines, of course. Studied medicine there, and in 1966, I came over to further my training at Swedish Hospital, which is on 8th Street. It's no longer Swedish Hospital now, but at that time, it was combined with St. Barnabas Hospital as the Metropolitan Medical Center, eventually joined up with Hennepin County and is now known as the Hennepin County Medical Center. So I did my surgery training there. And after training, I went to practice in Hudson, Wisconsin, where I presently live. Since about 2012, I think, I've gone back every couple of years or sometimes every year, and subsequently with my wife. We go with a group, Filipino doctors and nurses, and some American doctors and nurses also, to do medical missions in the, not in the city, but in rural areas, and we provide medical attention to those in need, those who cannot afford to seek medical attention because of their poverty. And some of them, they just wait for medical missions to come because they cannot afford to see the regular local doctors. So when we see them, sometimes their conditions are far advanced. You see big tumors, and which could have been easily removed when they were smaller, but when they see us, and sometimes it's inoperable, and just give them some relief for that. We have treated many patients. In the beginning, I was with a group that did general surgery also, so we would have to go to a place where they have hospitals big enough to accommodate the surgical procedures. In the later missions that we did, we only did minor surgeries and medical and pediatric consultations. So it was rewarding for me to go and perform this charitable work, and so it was for all the members of our mission groups. And I see some of my friends who are here have joined me in those missions. So, and the people were very, very thankful also for the service we provide them.
Well, I appreciate you being on the panel tonight, and I do appreciate the attendance from the Minnesota Filipino Association that are here.
Mr. Scott, was there any consideration to trying to negotiate a surrender of the city before sending in troops, or was that just not possible because the Japanese were no longer communicating?
We found very early on, actually, within the first week of the battle, we found in one of the cemeteries in Manila a burned copy of Iwabuchi's plan of defense for the city. We very quickly had it translated, and in the analysis of it, and they wrote, the analysts wrote in the top, there is no plan of withdrawal. And so we knew very early on, from within the first week of the battle, that this was going to be a fight to the death. And so negotiating with them to get them to come out was really was not an option. In the end, when we had them in sort of inside the finance, agriculture, and legislature, there was consideration of starving them out at that point. But the problem is we knew that they had so well stocked themselves and had wells that it could take months. And we were ready to, begin. And they, by being able to shoot outside of those buildings, I mean, they could, and those buildings are located right smack in the middle of downtown Manila there. It would paralyze an area of, a couple miles, really. And the Americans just didn't have the patience to wait them out for that. So the idea was then, to go in. And there were no civilians in the building at that point. It literally was just finishing off I think there were approximately 700 Japanese fighters inside those last few buildings. So it was finishing them off and being able to move on.
My father was on Guam during the Korean War, and there's still a lot of Japanese on the island, and they couldn't surrender because the Guamanians would have killed them. And there was a lot of bad feeling there. Was there any similar bad feeling against the Japanese in the aftermath of the occupation and the Battle of Manila?
There was a lot of hatred, I think. In fact, I read in the news early on that when a team of Japanese representatives came to the Philippines to see about reparations, and when they were inspecting all the damaged infrastructure, the people stoned them because of their hatred for them.
And one thing I'll add too to that is, there were folks during the occupation who collaborated with the Japanese, and they were known by as Makapilis, which was and they were frequently targeted by the Filipino guerrillas for assassination and things like that. And they would frequently cut off one person's ear, and that was the symbol that this person had been killed for cooperating with the Japanese.
I think it was for that reason that we moved out from our town because of the Makapilis,
Yeah.
Has this book been translated into Japanese? And also, what's the knowledge of this Rampage in Japan?
Yeah, we're still awaiting the Japanese request to publish a translation. So expecting it any day now. The Japanese in general, my experience has been, don't have a real tendency to want to buy American books for translation. I mean, the book has been, the book is sold in the Philippines quite well. In fact, did a whole book tour over there last year. I mean, that said, there are groups in Japan that recognize what happened in Manila, what happened in Nanking, and places like that, and are working to advance that knowledge. And so, in fact, when I was over there, I was in Japan in November, and I went down and I visited the Kyoto Museum of World Peace, which is there in Kyoto, and I was stunned to find that they had a really big display, including diaries of Japanese soldiers from the rape of Nanking, and which is something that, there's still, I mean, if you put something on Twitter about the rape of Nanking, there will be trolls out there that will attack you for, oh, it's all lies, whatnot, But here was a museum in Japan that had that, and when I was interviewing afterwards the director of that museum, my first question was, I'm stunned to see this. How do you do this? And he said, because we're private, and we can do that. And so, yeah, there's definitely that tug of war, but there are organizations and groups. If you go each year to the Battle of Manila Remembrance, which they hold there in Old Walled City, the statue behind me, there are frequently going to be a couple of guest speakers from Japan. And they've done research on it. So it's kind of, like I said, it's a mixed bag.
What kind of relief efforts were done after the Battle of Manila? And also, my second question is, how is the economy of the Philippines after the Battle of Manila and now today?
I mean, the Americans had their hands full afterwards, no doubt about it. I mean, the city was so catastrophically destroyed that we were having to bring in through Lingayen Gulf, I mean, just shiploads of everything from pots and pans to mosquito nets and soap, food and things like that. There was a huge sanitation crisis, as you might be able to imagine, massive amounts of rubble everywhere. There was no running water, there was no electricity, so we had to build latrines and things of that nature. We were literally using ship power at one point until we could get the power stations back on. There was also this huge problem of all the unexploded ordnance, which, as you can imagine, was everywhere there. So we had to go out and literally dig up and bring as much of that as we could. And we brought a lot of it, I think, into La Luneta, which is a big park area right by the Manila Hotel. And we're trying to figure out how we were going to dispose of just tons and tons of this. And then the sun heated it up so much that it ignited part of it. It was a huge explosion, and the problem was thus solved. Largely. That said, there were still, for years afterwards, people still stepping on unexploded ordnance and things like that as well. So as far as the rebuilding of Manila, the Japanese, I think in 1956, offered a very token sum of about $300 million, which was really basically like offering a Band-Aid to a gunshot wound for rebuilding the city. Manila was so heavily destroyed that what you saw was the development of Makati, which is a city just south of Manila, and that's where today you go and it's all the steel and glass high-rises and department stores and things like that, because in a lot of ways it was easier to start over than to rebuild. So, and that's a direct legacy of this battle.
But my question is, what airfield did you leave from in the Philippines to go to Okinawa, and where did you land? Was it Naha or Kadena?
As I remember, I think it was off the island of Mandora, I think. Does that sound right? Mandora, I think. And we were on our way to Okinawa.
Militarily, how important was the battle for the Philippines? Could we have bypassed them and gone on without attacking, or was that more for MacArthur's ego?
For folks who don't know the story about Douglas MacArthur in the Philippines, in 1944 in the summer, there was a big planning strategy in Hawaii in which the MacArthur and the Navy were trying to determine sort of what was going to be the next step. And the Navy had wanted, Ernest King, who is the Chief of Naval Operations, had wanted the U.S. to bypass the Philippines and to go on to Formosa, or Taiwan today. And so he sent Chester Nimitz to Hawaii to do his bidding on this. And MacArthur was there to basically pitch the Army side. And of course, that for MacArthur was to redeem his promise of returning. Now, MacArthur, if you read his memoir, he talks about how he was had no idea why he was being summoned to Hawaii and whatnot, and he showed up and was blindsided by all of this, which is the diary of his personal pilot disproves all of that. He knew exactly what he was doing. In fact, that long flight all the way from Australia to Hawaii, he was pacing the back of that B-17, rehearsing his speech and what he was going to do and his talking points. In fact, he would go up there with the pilots and he would go over it with Dusty and say, "What do you think about this argument and that?" And so by the time he actually gets to Hawaii, he's got all this in his head. And so he goes and they have this strategy session. And, Nimitz, didn't really do a heavy job of selling it, if you will. In fact, King kind of later got on him about that, in part because I think Nimitz also saw that MacArthur had some valid points. And MacArthur's points largely were humanitarian ones, and that the Philippines, and it's difficult for people today who might not remember that history, but there was a close symbiotic relationship between the Philippines and the United States at the outbreak of World War II. I mean, it was our only colony that we'd ever had. There were huge business ties there. Lots of Americans had cycled through there, whether they were civilians or military. And so the loss of the Philippines was a really big deal, and we had thousands of American civilians as well as service members that were prisoners and internees of the Japanese there. And so, and MacArthur made that moral argument that we owed it. He had vowed to return, but that we owed it as a nation to the Philippines to redeem that pledge as soon as possible. And how bad would it look to the rest of the world if America, at its first chance to retake its former colony, just skipped it, if you will. And I think he's got a really good point there, in fact. And beyond that, there's a good point to be made that had we not come back had we waited till the end of the war, which is what the Navy had advocated, the quote, let it wither on the vine, I think was the terminology they used, we would have had a different catastrophe in the Philippines. I mean, those 3,700 internees at Santo Tomas were literally, they were down to 580 calories a day is what they were surviving on. There were 500 children inside that camp. And these were executives, for the most part, from prestigious American companies, you know, and they would all die. And so would all the ones at Bilibid, and so would all the ones at Los Baños, and certainly all the service members hanging on at Cabanatuan and whatnot. And so we would have lost all that. And then you would have had the humanitarian catastrophe of all the Filipinos who were starving to death at that point as well. So you might have saved the buildings, but you would have had the loss of all those people. And furthermore, that would have all reverberated through the small town newspapers to the major newspapers, you know, so-and-so and his wife, you know, of Minneapolis starved to death in camp. And you would have seen that replayed in newspapers across the country. And so that was largely the argument that MacArthur made. So it really, in a lot of ways, it's kind of a catch-22. You know, do you come back like what happened in the Battle of Manila and the city largely gets destroyed, or do you bypass it and let everybody die? So, I mean, I think that's kind of how I tend to see that.
Just a comment. I've got your book and really want I cherish it only because I am a son of a Filipino scout who was in the 7-day Bataan Death March from Mariveles to San Fernando before they went up to Cabanatuan. He survived 3 years as a prisoner of war, and in 1948, because he served with the Philippine Scouts in the U.S. Army, he was able to come to the United States and became a U.S. citizen. I was born in Kansas, but I am also a veteran, and I want to say to Vic, thank you for supporting the Filipinos when you came over. My dad never told the story until 1978, because veterans just don't talk. But he finally told the story. Dr. Furman, I live in Hudson, Wisconsin, so we'll have to gather. And just one last thing, I was able to go to the Philippines finally January of 1919, and I ran the 63-mile march that my dad took from Mariveles to San Fernando, and really got to honor my dad doing that without bayonets in my back.
Or James or Vic, I was wondering how Japanese POWs were treated in this whole situation, because I've heard a lot of examples of how it was different than the way German POWs may have been treated. So if you could talk about that a little bit.
The Japanese prisoners of war, they were, well, I wasn't in on the raid on Los Baños. I did go through the New Bilibid prison after it was evacuated. I think they were treated real bad. I didn't see any of the events of it, but I've seen plenty of pictures and everything. But I can't really answer your question from anything I saw.
Okay. Well, listen, let's end at this point. Thank you for coming this evening. James and Vic and Ruben will be up at the desk in the lobby. So go up there, buy a book, ask some questions, and Mr. Matthews here might have some input. Thank you. We'll see you next month.
Support for this program provided by viewers like you. Thank you. Additional support provided through the Catherine B. Anderson Fund of the St. Paul Foundation. Upcoming roundtable topics can be found at www.mn-ww2roundtable.org. Production services provided by Barrows Productions.